The Juneau World Affairs Council and Veterans for Peace Chapter 100, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2025 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Unratified, the International Law of the Sea Treaties, and their potential for protecting Arctic resources and cultures. In this session, is there another path for Indigenous peoples? Barbara Wáahlaal Gidaak Blake, Vice President of Oceans Conservancy, will explore whether Indigenous peoples should rely on international treaties at all.
Dalang hadala is, atlant is, athdi gudunai lagang, Wáahlaal Gidaak hinudi kiang, Barbara Blake atsatai hinudi kiang, Francis Demert Peel di nanu ijan, Ilskade Sandra Demert di au ijan, Ken Johnson di had u ijang, Franklin Demert Sr. di chin u ijang, Gaya Laskust u di kwalangang, di yak John gagang, hik da hunglai us ijang. Good people, it's an honor to be with you today. My grandmother was Frances Demert Peel from Hikta Hunglai or Heidelberg. She was Yak Janas or Raven from the Shark House. My mother is Ilskade or Sandra Demert. She's sitting right here. Also from Hikta Hunglai. My father is Ken Johnson. He's from Chestachina. He is Otna Athabaskan. His clan is Nelchina, or the Sky Clan. My grandfather was Franklin Demert Sr. He was Tlene D from Sloak. And I currently live here in Santa Kahini on the homeland of the Akwán and in the Taku area, the Taku Kwan. It's an honor to be with all of you today, and I'm excited to engage in this conversation. I'm a little bit nervous after the last speaker because she was so amazing. Thank you, Doctor. That was a great presentation, and hopefully what I have to share is complementary to the information that you were sharing with everybody today. I've been in this work at Ocean Conservancy for about a year and a half. But before this, I worked in a series of advocacy roles for Alaska Native and Indigenous peoples. And when I got this job, I was asked during the interview panel, you've done a lot of advocacy for Indigenous people. How does that translate to conservation? How does that translate to work for our ocean? To which I responded, Indigenous people are interconnected with the ocean and the world around us so intricately, especially for Alaska Natives whose contact was later than the rest of the United States, that as we see the ocean deteriorate, as we see the world around us deteriorate, so you see our cultures. Almost, we were referred to by multiple scholars, Indigenous scholars, as the canary in the mine shaft. So when you know that Indigenous people can no longer sustain themselves and live in the homelands of their ancestry, you know we've done something so terrible that we cannot repair. But also in thinking of what that looks like, because we hold that balance and this intricate relationship with the ocean, with the world around us, with our beyond human relatives that live in the ocean and on the land, we know that protecting our way of life, protecting Indigenous ways of life, is also protecting the ocean. It's also protecting these lands, and it's also protecting the beyond humans that reside in these places, our relatives. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about what that means for us as we've gathered our people multiple times to have these conversations of what it would look like to not just engage in a space where we are oftentimes an afterthought, to not just engage in a space where we get a seat at the table but not a voting seat at the table. What does it look like for us to work and design our own table, to create our own set of laws, and to develop our own ways of sharing with the world our understanding and the balance we've kept since time immemorial with the world around us? What does it look like when we start flexing that sovereignty muscle and saying, these are the laws as we know them as Indigenous people. These are the laws that guide how we operate in these places and on these lands. And we hope that the world will see this and also consider what would it look like if we were to uphold Indigenous relationships the same that they do, but on a personal level or on a national level or on an international level. What would that look like? We had a gathering, and I'll talk about that here in a minute, but Jonathan Samuelson, who is Yupik and Tlingit, had a really amazing if you've ever heard him speak, it's just like straight poetry that drips out of his mouth, and he's an amazing speaker, an amazing leader of our people. But he was talking about, what does it mean to have an indigenous law of the sea? Why is it important for indigenous people to make these statements and to say these things? And he made this statement that our waters speak their own language, and we as indigenous people are the interpreters of that language for the world. And he was talking about not just, that we speak or can translate a language that is different than others. He was talking about how indigenous people, even in today's context, have never lost that relationship, that are on the waters day in and day out and know the changes, know the significant changes we're seeing in our beyond human relatives, or the ice, or the currents, or the way that the earth is in relationship with the ocean. We know what's happening. We can share that with the world. And so when you're considering what that means, to me, that means that as a scientist, and you're coming in to explore a space or write a paper about a certain species or a certain area, you're probably going to come in and maybe do a couple months, maybe 6 months at the most, of study of that place. And if you are missing the indigenous knowledge, indigenous science component, you're not getting that full picture. You're just getting a 6 month or maybe even a year glimpse of what that place looks like. But if you were to have indigenous knowledge or indigenous science at that table, the interpretation or the translation of indigenous people of this place, you'd get a full perspective. You'd get not only just the current day-to-day, this is what it looks like, this is how it's changing, but how it's changed over millennia, how it's changed over generations of ancestors sharing that knowledge and passing that knowledge down from one generation to the next, of how this place has changed, how this place has shifted, and what the current context is today. And so his ability to express that in way better eloquent words than I ever could is one of the reasons that I wanted to share as kind of a starting point of what I'm talking about as we're thinking about the indigenous law of the sea. This is my son, Wáahlaal Nathaniel Blake. He graduated from Juneau Douglas High School. He's off right now in Haida Gwaii in a year-long language immersion through a partnership at Simon Fraser University. So we're really proud of him. But the reason that I bring Nathan into our space, Wáahlaal has taught me so much more about what it means to have a relationship with our ocean, have a relationship with our culture, and how in protecting our culture, you're protecting the ocean, you're protecting our way of life, you're protecting the land and all of the non-human beings in this place. I was a single mom raising him until he was about the age of 12. And I don't mean single mom as in I shared custody. His father, my ex-husband, was completely not in the picture, so completely 100% relying on me to raise a boy as a woman. And at the age of 12, his grandma had made sure that he was fishing. As soon as he could get on a boat, he was out there fishing every summer and making sure he was being a functional member of our community and getting out and subsisting or living our ways of life in Kloak on a regular basis. And at the age of 12, he caught not only enough fish that particular time, his share in the catch was not only enough to feed me and my mom and me and my son, but it was enough to feed multiple households in our community. And at the time, Stathkawas Della Cheney, who lives here in Zantakahini as well, said it's time for his coming of age ceremony. And she wanted me to realize that it wasn't because, and wanted him to realize it wasn't because he caught a fish. It wasn't a marker of his manhood that he caught a fish. A marker of his manhood was that he could care for our community, that he went out and caught enough fish to feed multiple households in our community. And that meant to her that he was a man now. And that, at that ceremony, this was my first time ever putting on a ceremony for a young man to come into manhood. But he gifted more salmon from that time that he caught the fish. He gifted to everybody who was present to witness his coming of age ceremony. And people like Lyle James stood up and made public proclamations to help guide him into manhood. And I sat with that as a female trying to raise a young man in how to be a man. What do I know about being a man? There's not much that I could teach him in terms of what his responsibility is as a man in our community. but listening to all the men who stood up in that moment and made public proclamations to continue to guide him, gifting him tools he would need to continue to harvest and continue to provide for our communities and for our people. And in that instance, I sat with what I was witnessing, not just my son coming of age, but how our culture folds every single person in to make sure nobody is left behind, that his responsibility is beyond himself. He doesn't get to walk around thinking that I have a responsibility just to me and I can do whatever I want and act however I want. But our culture taught him in that instance that his responsibility is to our community, that his marker of being a man was a marker of his commitment to continue to provide for our people and for our community. And fast forward a few years in kind of a relational opportunity for him to connect those dots and also continue to teach me. We were getting ready to go out fishing here in Aquan territory, and I was getting a permit. He didn't need one at the time because you don't need one when you're of that age. But I was getting a fishing permit from the state of Alaska. And he was like, "Why are you getting a fishing permit from the state of Alaska, Mom? That's so weird." He's like, we're gonna be fishing in Aquan territory. Shouldn't you get a permit from the Aquan? And I was like, well, yeah, I mean, traditionally that's how it would be. We would ask permission for us to harvest on their land, and if you didn't, right, that meant war. And so his knowledge at that moment was a recognition of his responsibility. We're guests here. Our family is not from Juneau. It's not from Xantakahini. We are guests on this land, and he was recognizing that in that moment, that we are guests here in this place. So I looked at him and I said, well, the Aquan doesn't have a permitting process yet. But what would it look like, Bud, like for us to uphold what you're expressing to me and your concern? And he said, well, what if we catch a fish and part of our fish goes to the Aquan? And I was like, Bud, that's a great idea. And so from that point on, if we were harvesting in Aquan territory or in Takuquan territory, we made sure to gift part of whatever our responsibility was to give that clan or those peoples part of our catch or part of our harvest, and we've been practicing that ever since. But in teaching me the reciprocal process, in unto itself was an act of an indigenous law of the sea law, right? Our laws as we've always known them. Can you imagine what it would look like if every single tourist coming into Juneau were to share their catch with the Aquan, right? We've seen this. We see what happens when hundreds, if not thousands of boxes leave our community with our fish every single summer. What would it look like if upholding the law that at the time he was 14-year-old son understood and knew, in just one example of what an indigenous law of the sea enacted in real time could look like if everybody decided, hey, you know what? Your practices go above and beyond what the state of Alaska says, what the federal government says, and what international treaties say. Maybe there's something to that. Maybe there's an understanding there that we need to consider and to think about. So fast forward to last November, we actually did it. We held a gathering in Fairbanks, and we brought over 100 different entities, and we invited corporations, INCSA corporations, and we invited tribes. We invited nonprofits that are operating for Indigenous people, and we said, let's come together and talk about what it would look like to host or to actually write an Indigenous law of the sea for Alaska. It was 3 days. You cannot download 15,000 years worth of information in 3 days. But what it did give us the opportunity was to provide a framework for what it would look like to go out and collect this information, or go out and respectfully ask for this information to be collected into a place where we could share it with the world. People came to the table, and some of the things that we realized were a lot of the folks were feeling like they didn't have the knowledge that could be input into an Indigenous law of the sea because they were not historians of our people. They didn't carry the orate history of our culture or our traditional stories, or they didn't speak the language. But the people who were sitting at the table with us were fishermen, or they were people who go out and harvest on a regular basis. And what we were trying to help them see was something that Linda Jewell, Reggie Jewell's wife, shared with us at Elders and Youth one year. She said, we hid aspects of who we were in our ways of living. In other words, our hunting, fishing, and gathering practices, we hid those aspects of our spirituality, of our connectedness to our language, of our connectedness to culture and our responsibility to community, in our ways of life to ensure they would never disappear. And if you think about it, our ways of life is the one aspect of our culture, our hunting, fishing, and gathering practices as Indigenous people that has never been severed. Everything else has been severed, right? We've severed our language, we've severed our religious practices, we've severed our clothing, our dancing, all of the aspects that make up who we are as Indigenous people have been sliced, right? There was a time during my parents' generation and my grandparents' generation where the state of Alaska, along with churches and the federal government, all conspired to slice and to sever that tie to our ancestry. But the thing that never got severed was our hunting, fishing, and gathering practices. And so I just love that quote by Linda, because it was a perfect iteration of what folks needed to hear in that moment. You're carrying this knowledge, even if you're not carrying the traditional stories of your people. Just by being on that water, you were taught how to act and how to operate on that water. You were taught how to act and operate beyond what the state or federal government or local laws tell you. In relationship with the ocean, you don't practice, or you don't work on food when you're in bad spirits, because that puts bad spirits into the food, and then you're giving that to other people, and you don't want to wish bad on other people. So just as a practice, just as a knowledge transference from one generation to the next, we are living those traditions, living those practices, and even if you're not a historian or a linguist, you carry these stories of these places from your predecessors, from your mentors, from your elders who have taught you how to have good relation with the place that you are fishing on the water in, or on the land and hunting, or just gathering. And so we realized quickly that we had to help people see that this was a different way of understanding what they've always known. These stories are there, you just have to be able to unbury them from what Western society has said is the norm, and pick that apart and pull away the weeds and see the truth of what Indigenous communities have been taught since time immemorial, and that is being taught from our ancestors down to us. And once we kind of shared a little bit more about what that could look like, they were like, yeah, actually I do carry that knowledge. I don't speak the language, but I'm out on that ocean every single day. I know the language of the ocean. I know the language of this place. And these stories that I've been taught on how to care for the ocean and how to have a relationship with the ocean are a part of our orate history. They are a part of our Indigenous laws that govern how we set protocols and how we operate today. So over 100 participants came together, led by the Ginga and Ignin Collective, which is a new nonprofit led by quite a few amazing ladies, Laganai Chichkitne from Cake, Shilunai Tanichkak, or Melissa Martin from Kodiak, Ayu Kasatak from Unalakleet, and Gail Cheney are all a part of the Indigenous, or the Ginga and Ignin Collective, and helped host that space. Ocean Conservancy helped pay for the gathering, but Ocean Conservancy is a non-native organization. We should not be leading this charge of writing an Indigenous law of the sea. It should be led by Indigenous people and by an Indigenous organization. We can continue to partner, and we will continue to partner, but it's not our place to step in and write the Indigenous law of the sea, being a non-native organization. It was a beautiful moment, and it was a start to a conversation. And what we realized in coming together, a lot of folks were like, why? We have all these other laws, with these other governing systems that are a part of the conversation. Why an Indigenous law of the sea? Why do we need to write down what we've always known? And then we had a long conversation about what we're witnessing as Indigenous people, the changes in our climate, the changes in our places, the melting of sea ice, the warming of the Arctic that is 4 times the rest of the world. These things are putting an imperative that and an urgency to our Indigenous community that maybe now is the time to actually try something else. Maybe what we've always known and these proposals and this information that keeps getting put forward, or this new latest iteration of this next great thing and that's going to save us all for climate change, maybe instead of looking at what is this next big thing? Maybe there was something to what has sustained this place for 15,000 years, and maybe there's some guidance and some information in that historic knowledge that lived in balance for 15,000 years that we can pull into today's context. Instead of the new shiny thing, what if it's a look back? What if it's a look back to how indigenous practices have always been? I'm sure all of you have heard and remember when they found one of our ancestors in a cave in Kloak. Right? This was one of our ancestors who was carbon dated to 10,000 years old. And Rosita Worrell and SHI decided to test our ancestor to people today and did DNA swabs of our people at Celebration one year. And lo and behold, right, the DNA matched, right? This is proof that this was one of our ancestors in a cave on Prince of Wales Island. But one thing that I always love to share and that folks forget that was part of that was that they found salmon DNA also associated with our ancestor, right? So that tells you, and right at the time, right, we had saber-tooth salmon. Like 10,000 years ago, it was saber-tooth salmon. I was like, way to go, ancestors. Like that's a feat for sure. But that proved to me that for 10,000 years, at least 10,000 years, we had a relationship with salmon. Right? We knew that this relationship was balanced enough that we could sustain who we were as indigenous people by living in balance with the salmon. And we've had a different management system in Alaska besides our indigenous one for what, 200 years? How many rivers are unable to fish right now? For the first time in our history of living in this place, which our stories go back into time immemorial, meaning we were born onto these lands. Raven pulled us from a clamshell, and that's where he created humans. For the first time in our lived history, we're severing that tie. That last tie to our ancestors is being cut. Because we're not listening. Because we're trying to force a different system and a different way of doing things. And maybe, just maybe, 9,800 years at least of living in balance has taught us that maybe indigenous people had some knowledge system that was keeping them in balance in a way that made sure everybody was taken care of. And so this is the urgency that we are pushing right now, right? We know the urgency is there. We see it in the climate changes, but we see it in the severing of our culture. We see it in the severing of who we've always been and who we hope our children get to continue to be. This is what I was referencing, but Grandma Faye Ewan, she's an aunt and elder from Copper Center, and if you've ever met her, she's shorter than me. She's a pretty fierce elder and just always speaks her mind. But she said this during the gathering, and you heard me kind of say something similar to that, but that they've run out of answers, and now they're coming to us because they've realized we've had the answers all along. Right? This is something to Grandma Faye just being fiery all the time. But I just love that she had that opportunity to share with us her thinking. And at our gathering, we brought together some catalyzers from different countries who are already doing this work. This is Jansarak, he's from Greenland. And we brought some Maori from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Guess what? They already wrote their Indigenous Law of the Sea because they're always 10 steps ahead of us. And we brought some Hawaiian relatives and other folks from different places to help catalyze our people into thinking about this in a different way and helping them to see what can be. And so an iteration of what this has looked like in kind of flexing our sovereignty muscle and kind of bringing forward what is and what can be was during Moana Nui Akea. How many people got a chance to celebrate with the Hawaiians? Right? It was an amazing celebration for quite a few days here in Juneau. And we were marking the launch of Moana Nui Akea, which is Hokulea's circumnavigation of the Pacific Ocean using nothing but traditional navigation. And one thing that we realized in having conversations about what an Indigenous Law of the Sea could look like was that it was a prime opportunity to take a stand. To say to the world, at least in a proclamation, not a full written out Indigenous Law of the Sea, but kind of like the preamble to what that could look like. And we We pulled together our people, had in-depth conversations about what should be in this document, had conversations with the Hawaiians. We had folks from Tahiti here, from New Zealand here, from Taiwan, Hawaii, Alaska, all the different places of Alaska, and everybody signed this proclamation recognizing indigenous rights to, in this particular instance, the Pacific Ocean, and how we've been stewards and caretakers of this place since time immemorial, and that we are the original caretakers of the ocean, essentially, is what it says. But it was just a marker in time of what I witnessed, that people were hungry and thirsty for something to be said about our relationship with the ocean and our relationship. And mind you, not just indigenous people signed this, right? Because there was people from all over. And so we had quite a few non-indigenous people, and it just showed me that the world and people are like, yes, please, more of this, because it's doing something. At least it's getting somewhere. And at least it's making a statement that we all wish we could make, but for lack of ability to navigate bureaucracy or infiltrate bureaucracy or even have a voting seat at the table, what do? What if we don't need to fight for a seat at somebody else's table? What if the table is ours? What if we as indigenous people are creating our own table and saying we're writing our own indigenous law of the sea? You know, all the rest of the bureaucrats, you guys can be observers of our writing of indigenous law of the sea. You can come in and give us your thoughts, but this is ours. This is for us to write and for us to make a stand as indigenous people, as the original governs and the original sovereigns of this Pacific Ocean in this instance, is our opportunity to flex that sovereignty muscle. And what does that look like? It's not a turning on its head, because we're not like that as indigenous people. A lot of folks think that if indigenous communities start operating and functioning just like the Western government does, that they're going to turn everything around, and all of a sudden indigenous people are going to be just as terrible to the Western government as the Western government has been to indigenous people. That has never been the case. If you look at, just as a for instance, when indigenous sovereignty through tribal sovereignty in the United States took over healthcare, our Indian Health Service, one of the fears from everybody who was employed in those instances was that all the non-native staff were going to get fired, and all the doctors and nurses and all the other receptionists and all the other staff were going to get fired, because indigenous communities had just like a pool of doctors just waiting there, you know? And that didn't happen, right? That was not the case. But what it did prove was that as indigenous people, us caring for our own people, and it could do so much better than the way that the Western government was caring for our people. And what it proved was that our life expectancy shot up by 20 years, right? Like, that's significant. That's a major feat. And that just proves that indigenous people will know what's best for indigenous people. And that's all this is. This is an opportunity for us to say, we know what's best for the ocean, and we know what's best for us in relation to the ocean, and this is our opportunity to flex that muscle. And so when I'm talking about a table, one of the things that I dreamed up quite a few years ago was the Federation of United Pacific Peoples. And I'm kind of being funny about this, because when I was dreaming this up, I was working at the university, and then I worked in the governor's office, and my brain thought, like, let's set an agenda, and let's have A, B, and C, and let's bring the people together, and then we're going to accomplish this, and then followed by this, and followed by this. And our first gathering of this conversation, we had some Hawaiian elders in the room, and one of them was Neil Hannes. He's president of the Polynesian Voyage Society, and he, as our elders tend to do, very gently kind of pulled me back and said, let's think about this a little differently. And he said, if you want an indigenous solution, you have to start with an indigenous process. And he said, when we were creating the Polynesian Voyage Society, we didn't start by creating the Polynesian Voyage Society. We didn't say, let's come together and create this society. We started by building Hokulea, and the society formed around it. And that's why the emphasis has been more so on writing the indigenous law of the sea than it is to bring our people together, because in a formalized setting or a formalized table, because just a natural outcrop of writing the indigenous law of the sea will bring our people to the same table, and it will be that big dream of mine to create something like the Federation of United Pacific Peoples. Or I was just at UNOC in France, and indigenous people, we were just kind of meandering around and realized really soon, and these are people from all across the globe, that we needed to have a sit down with each other, just each other, and have a conversation. And we started a pilot of Indigenous Peoples and Communities Oceans Alliance. We had folks from Africa all the way to Greenland sitting in the room and just having a conversation of what it would mean to say and to be able to navigate the spaces of say, UNOC or COP or any of these other spaces as Indigenous people, but also flexing our own sovereignty muscle. So I've been kind of talking about this already, but the indigenous law of the sea and giving you examples is something that right now, as we're getting ready to move it into the next phase, is having conversations with our community. And when we had the gathering in Fairbanks to write the outline and to develop that, and by the way, that outline is in draft form and it will be released to the public hopefully soon, so you can get a glimpse of that. But what we realized was that our leaders, yes, they have the stories, they carry the knowledge, but more importantly, a lot of folks are saying, you know who you should be talking to is our fishermen. You should be talking to our hunters. You should be talking to the people who are out there on the waters on a regular basis, because they carry the knowledge. They carry the protocols and the responsibility of what it means to go out into these places. And they carry it and pass it on to future generations. And so we realized that the next iteration has to be not only a conversation with our historians, our linguists, our storytellers, but it has to be a conversation with our fishermen and our hunters and our gatherers, the people who are out and in of these places on a regular basis. One of the other things that we realized in that document and in that formation of what this framework would look like is that it's not just about oceans, right? We as an indigenous people do not see the disconnect between how we care for the ocean or how we care for the rivers. We understand that the two are connected. We understand that a salmon doesn't stop at the Yukon River and say, oh, can't go up there. I am an ocean salmon, right? That's not how the world works. And that's an understanding that we have always understood, that if we over-harvest at the lower end of a river, it's going to impact the people at the upper end of the river. If we do damage to our part of the ocean, we know it's going to impact other people. And our responsibility is not just to the greater community, but to the other communities and the other peoples around us. And keeping in balance, not just with nature, but keeping in balance with the communities and the people who are neighbors to us and who we know that we had to live in balance with for thousands of years. Otherwise, there would be war. And there often was war. So how do you keep balance with your neighbors and the people that live next to you who don't happen to be from your same nation, but are important to pull into the same conversation? And so it's a growth and it's a regional conversation in our next iteration, but it is also an opportunity for us to sit down and start reclaiming our governance spaces, honoring things like our ancestral highways. One thing Nainoa and the Polynesian Voyage Society said they wanted to do was reclaim the highway between Tahiti and Hawaii, because that has been their ancestral highway for a millennia. And that highway is something that a lot of anthropologists cannot prove, right? You cannot prove migration over water, because how are you going to find all of the things that social scientists like to study, right? They're inside the water, the things that have dropped off. And so just recognizing what can go into an indigenous law of the sea is our relationship not only with each other, but also our relationship globally beyond the state of Alaska. In Alaska, we have 21 different linguistic groups. We are not the same people. I'm as different to the Inuit up north as I am to, people in Russia. Like, that's the difference in our cultural base. And we understand that our relationship with waters is also different. Our protocols are different. So everybody's like, how are you going to write an indigenous law of the sea that encompasses all these different cultures? You're not the same people. Well, that is true. And there can be regional provisions that dictate how the indigenous people of that place operate. But then if you pull it up to a higher level, there are commonalities and threads that govern all of us. There are things that we understand and that we know that are mutually similar to each other enough that we can put them into something like an indigenous law of the sea that is more comprehensive of indigenous people holistically. As an example, when we harvest, we don't harvest for just ourselves. As Haida and Tlingit people, that's not how we operate. Almost every single Alaska Native community operates that same exact way. We don't harvest just for us. I'm not going out to catch a fish for just me. I'm going out to catch a fish to feed multiple people, to make sure that different people are not going without. And that's a commonality for all of us. So as an example of what could be a common thread that is in indigenous law of the sea. And you heard me talk about this for Linda Jewell, and this is just a cute picture of my son. And so writing the indigenous law of the sea and signing it into law, we're taking a cue from our Maori brothers and sisters who have already moved this forward. And mind you, Maori have the Treaty of Waitangi, so they have a treaty that governs how their relationship is with the federal government. We don't have that. But they've already started moving their indigenous law of the sea into federal law. So the laws that they have written as indigenous people are now being integrated into their federal legal system. What would it look like for us to take something, our indigenous protocols, all of those things, and to be able to put them into a document that is legible, that is for the world to see, and that other people started saying, hey, you know what, this is actually really good policy. Maybe this is something we can figure out how to integrate into our systems, into legal systems that are beyond indigenous communities and tribes. And so when we're thinking about what can be some of the action that is already moving and getting into place, one of the initiatives that came out of this time together for writing our indigenous law of the sea was folks were saying, what if, this idea of personhood, we've seen other countries do it, it's pretty amazing. The likelihood of the federal government or the state government doing it is probably pretty unlikely. But the third sovereign that we always forget about when we're doing work is our tribal sovereigns in the United States, at least. And so we've been talking about what it would look like in a manner of personhood. What if you said killer whales are now tribal citizens of Cake? What if you said salmon are now tribal citizens of Cake? What if you created a different class of citizenship, which we have different classes in the United States, so tribes can do this as well. They get to say who their citizens are. What if they had a citizenship for our beyond human relatives? And then tribal law applied to our beyond human relatives as well. The way that the tribal law works in Alaska is that if you come into contact with me as a tribal citizen and you violate tribal law, I can bring you to tribal court. What if you were to violate a killer whale as a non-tribal person from that tribe? You could get a citation and you could be held liable in tribal court if a killer whale is now a tribal citizen. So just as an example of what structure to action could look like and something that we're having conversations about. One of our brothers in the first initial conversation when Neil Hannes kind of gave me a good lesson was a gentleman from, he's from Tahiti, and he really just coined this really well, and I was thinking about what it could look like and just really putting that imagery in my mind of what it would look like for Indigenous people to lock arms and come walking into a room with our set of laws and saying, UNOC or BB&J, this is great that you have this, here's and this. Not just this, but also this. We're not saying that BB&J, all of these things are not good. We're just saying that maybe there's room for improvement, right? And so what would it look like for us to lock arms, come into a room and say, these are our laws, and maybe you can consider throwing them into the law of the sea or the BB&J. And so thinking about what it would look like for the world to uphold our agreements and thinking about what the world could look like if everybody started operating in under accordance with how our protocols are set for how we treat our oceans, how we treat our beyond human relatives, is just a big dream, right? It's a dream for all of us to think about how living in right relation with the world around us means that everybody is taken care of. From a standpoint of my 12-year-old son, you know, his understanding of our protocols, of our laws, meant that his responsibility is beyond himself. His responsibility is to our community and to our peoples and to the greater community. And so what if everybody lived that way? What if everybody said, yes, we want to uphold your indigenous laws because you know what? They go above and beyond what is set in motion as it stands today. And with that, that's the presentation on the indigenous law of the sea. So I'm willing to take questions now.
So I have a question. How is your relationship with the state of Alaska in dealing with Fish and Game or other agencies of the state? And it seems really important since the state appoints the majority of the members of the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. I think we tried to get someone more indigenous related on there, but it was kind of taken over by the trawl fleet. And how's it going with the state of Alaska? It seems they need to be a partner in your work.
The work that, for our Arctic and Northern Waters team, we're in that space every single council meeting. Not me personally, my staff is. And yes, there could be better relations between Indigenous people and the state of Alaska as it stands. And it's all circumstantial between who's the governor. Some governors choose to prioritize Indigenous peoples, some choose not to. And right now, we're definitely an administration that is prioritizing trawling over local fisheries. But I agree, there needs to be a greater emphasis on those relations with our state government.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. It just got my mind racing as a professor of what I used to call the law of the sea. It's a law of the sea. And if we stop talking about Grotius and Binkershoek and start talking about 10,000 years before them, then we will finally understand more about relationship to the ocean, to the beyond human characters in our world, right? Yeah. And yesterday, what you set out is the answer to what we kept returning to, which is why does the United States object to Part 11 in the Law of the Sea Treaty, which is about seabed mining, and to the provision elsewhere that says you have to give, if you're mining resources from the seabed, you have to pay a tax, 1% in the 6th year, 2% after that. And we had views from across the spectrum represented, and that the promise that held out historically at the time for the newly decolonized African countries was huge. And that's why the concept of the common heritage of mankind came to be. Maybe people were talking about this in the negotiating halls, but back then there were very few, if any, Indigenous representations in the negotiations. So it's just one example of how this very promising and realistic project to me, this is not at all gauzy, to borrow an adjective that was used to criticize the approach of the common heritage, but it's concrete, it's real, and it addresses problems with actual solutions. So thank you for helping me see this in a new light. And I've heard about the project. IU has said, I need to talk to you. You need to meet Barbara. So thank you for the introduction. It's very exciting.
Thank you. I love that. It's not the law of the sea, but a law of the sea. I love that. Yeah, that's awesome. I will say, folks are like, how can we help? What can we do? We need money to do this. So if you know of anybody who can help fund the continuation of this work, we have some, and we have some prospects. But if you know folks who are interested in helping develop this, we have relations in Colombia and in Chile and New Zealand and Hawaii and Ainu of Japan. Folks are primed and ready to start this initiative. It's just a matter of how do we get people to commit to funding and to supporting in capacity as well as finances.
That was Barbara Wáahlaal Gidaak Blake discussing, Is There Another Path for Indigenous Peoples? It was recorded October 11th, 2025 at KTOO on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlinke-Ani as part of the 2025 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Unratified, the International Law of the Sea Treaties and Their Potential for Protecting Arctic Resources and Cultures. Produced by the Juneau World Affairs Council and Veterans for Peace Chapter 100 in collaboration with KTOO. With support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine, Wastman & Associates, Ramada Inn,